Welcome to the NSWA's second last webinar in our spring webinar series in 2023. One Wednesday each month, usually the first Wednesday, we will be bringing you experts from their field to talk about various aspects of watershed health and governance so that you can learn something new and ask some questions about questions to our speakers over your lunch hour. So my name is Mary Ellen. I am the Senior Watershed Planning and Project Coordinator here at the NSWA, and it's my pleasure to be your host this hour. So before we begin, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping things to keep the webinar running smoothly. First, we are recording the session today so that we can share the information on our YouTube channel. And in fact, after the session is over, you can feel free to take a look at some of our past sessions and learn more about watershed science and governance. We would appreciate it if you would keep your microphones muted during the discussion. There will be a chance for you to ask questions at the end of the session, and we actually encourage you to use the chat box in order to ask your questions throughout, and we'll get to them at the end. And after the webinar is over today, we will be sending you a feedback survey to find out what you thought about today's session, about the topic, and the format that we used in order to host the webinar today. We, at the end, will be drawing a name for a giveaway. We actually have two giveaways. One is this NSWA's calendar, and as well, we're giving out today a lovely Riparian Web Portal sweater with our Riparian Web Portal logo on it. So stay tuned to the end to see if you're one of the lucky, the lucky winner. We want to start off today's webinar in a good way and acknowledge that the lands that flow into the North Saskatchewan River they overlap with Treaty 6, Treaty 8, and the Métis homeland. These lands are the traditional territories, they're the traveling routes, the gathering places of the Cree, Saulteaux, Blackfoot, Métis, Dene, Stoney, and Nakota Sioux people. We recognize and thank the Indigenous people who have cared for this land since time immemorial, and whose rich histories, their experiences, their teachings, languages, and presence continue to enrich these sacred lands that we all steward as treaty people. The NSWA recognizes that the watershed management system and its practitioners continue to perpetuate a colonial system that excludes and ignores perspectives offered by Indigenous culture and knowledge. We make this statement as an affirmation. We are committed as an organization and as individuals to improving the relationship for a better watershed for all of us. Fulfilling the spirit and intent of treaties is an ongoing process, and we're committed to building strong and respectful relationships with Indigenous people of this land and working together to care for the land, water, and all living beings who call this watershed home. So I'm going to take a short pause, and with that, I encourage you to reflect on your own place within the watershed, either as a representative of your organization and as an individual, and think of ways that you can learn and grow to be a better treaty person so that we can all advance for conciliation together. Thank you. So today's webinar is a little different than what than our usual format. Instead of the typical PowerPoint presentation style that we normally use, we're opting instead to have a free flow conversation between our guests today as we explore the role of natural infrastructure in building resilient communities. I'd now like to introduce you to our speakers. I'm really excited to introduce you to Scott, our Executive Director here at NSWA, and our special guest, and Joanna. And now I've already forgotten how to pronounce your last name. We talked about this beforehand, but it's mine Eyquem. Like a sift. Okay, say it one more time.
Eyquem.
Eyquem, perfect. Thank you so much. And Joanna is with the Intact Center on Climate Change, which is based in the University of Waterloo. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to the two of you to get the conversation going.
If you can pull down the PowerPoint.
Yes.
That would be fantastic. Excellent. So I'm just going to spotlight the two of us so that everybody can see who's speaking. Here's Joanna, and I'm going to add a spotlight to me. So I was going to say good morning, but apparently that's just the way today is going. It's afternoon. So good afternoon, Joanna. How are you?
Good afternoon. I'm good. Thanks, Scott. It's good to see you.
Happy International Women's Day and welcome to the NSWA webinar series. This is the second time we've done this kind of an interview format. I find them really fun to do because I get to actually talk to people. It's not just a sort of a listen thing. And I know you do a lot of interviews, like you do a lot of pieces with the media and other things. Do you have kind of a go-to introduction that you use for yourself that kind of captures who you are and what you do?
Yeah, I think what I do is trying to accelerate how we adapt to climate risks that are coming for us. So that's kind of trying to accelerate action on the ground, particularly for flooding, extreme heat, wildfire, and how we use and work with nature. In terms of where I come from, I'm British, so I bring a whole baggage of about 10 years experience from the UK. So my Britishness is kind of screaming that Centre was written with ER. So yeah, so there's I make some kind of language errors. That is probably just the British speak coming through. And so I'm often trying to kind of accelerate using ideas that I've already worked with in Europe, bring those to Canada as well. And I'm a geomorphologist by training. So as a geomorphologist, I often see myself or my profession as kind of the glue between engineering and ecology. We care about function. So that's a lot of what I think about is how natural systems work. So this conversation about watershed scale and natural assets is really one of my passion points.
So you talked about sort of this connection between sort of engineering, sort of a built environment perspective and natural, sort of the natural systems. And I know when we sort of advertise this webinar and we're talking about what you and I had talked about, what we're going to cover today, we were kind of getting into the space of natural assets, natural infrastructure, nature-based solutions, which are all kind of things on the same. How do you explain natural assets? Like, are there particular kind of pictures that you would draw for people, or how do you explain natural assets?
Yeah, a lot of people that we talk to, they're very familiar with built assets. So they have kind of this picture of what a built asset is. And so a natural asset is basically a unit that provides different ecosystem services. And we think of natural assets and also kind of enhanced assets and engineered assets. This kind of classification came from the Municipal Natural Assets Initiative, who I work with very closely. So a natural asset is something like a forest or a wetland that is kind of more intact. An engineered asset is more at the opposite end. So kind of you can think about green roofs that are not really natural, but are trying to mimic natural processes like infiltration, for example. And then in the middle, we have enhanced assets, which are often kind of restored or kind of modified natural assets that like green space, parks, restored or constructed wetlands, that kind of thing. So that it's a bit of a continuum. So, and actually we're trying to make that delineation clearer. So there is a standard on inventory of natural assets that will be coming out shortly. So hopefully these terms are a little bit more defined for people.
So if I'm reading into that, anything that's the natural assets and the natural environment are basically the same thing, and then there's other things that are built from them. So is there, I guess where my brain goes are there examples of sort of natural environment that are not natural assets? Or...
No, I think what it would fall into one of those three categories, and it's how we delimit between those categories. One thing that we have talked about a lot is whether natural infrastructure and natural assets are interchangeable. And what we were discussing in that conversation was that a lot of natural assets actually provide infrastructure services. So they can be termed as infrastructure. But some natural assets, they also provide other services that are not infrastructure related. So, spiritual services or historical kind of services. So natural assets we see as a bit of a wider term than natural infrastructure. And natural infrastructure is an important term, though, from my perspective, because that is the term that is used by the federal government a lot when we're talking about the Natural Infrastructure Fund, for example. And Infrastructure Canada are very much interested in natural infrastructure. So we want to keep using that term too.
So is that then, it sounds like it's just a subset really of, or a different lens through which you can view the natural environment. So the natural environment is a natural asset, and then you can classify them like infrastructure as a kind of service, or cultural as a kind of service. So it's just another kind of a metadata that goes attached to these things. Is that a fair way to describe it?
Yeah, and it's recognizing the services that are provided, because traditionally we haven't been very good about transparently making it clear that nature does provide a service. We just kind of take those services for granted. So it's a bit more a way of making that service element more transparent and acknowledged.
Does the terminology get in the way sometimes? Like, it seems like, I know even when you and I met originally in Winnipeg, like a couple of months ago, there was discussion around all of these different aspects. And in your experience, does the terminology kind of get in people's way? It's like, what are we talking about today? It's like, natural infrastructure. What? That's a new term. I thought it was ecosystem goods and services.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And particularly the term nature-based solutions, actually, I have had issues with, because it means different things to different people. And like, I remember reading some letters of people against nature-based solutions because they basically saw it as carbon offsets. That was the lens that they were looking at nature-based solutions, was basically to excuse pollutant like emitters of greenhouse gases, because they saw nature-based solutions as pretty much synonymous with tree planting. Whereas to me, nature-based solutions is much more about, any solution to a societal problem where we work with nature is a nature-based solution to me. So it depends what baggage people bring to them them, as well as to how they interpret those terms. But I think the global biodiversity framework has also helped a little bit with that, because we are talking about nature-based solutions in the framework, and also nature's contributions to people. So nature is obviously valuable in and of itself, but we also recognize that nature provides a lot of services to us, and we are not really separate from it.
So let's start tying this now to sort of the other piece of what you do, which is, it's about building resilience in communities. And that was actually the title of the webinar, is like, natural assets in community resilience. How do you start tying those two pieces together?
Yeah, for me, this is the lens that I come to natural assets. I do a lot of work on natural assets and kind of accounting for them, but how I use come to the research element is really through the lens of climate adaptation. So particularly in terms of managing flood risk, so how we work with nature to slow down the flow, to store the flow, to restore natural processes that have actually, we've modified already to speed up the flow in many places, to kind of reverse that trend. On the coast as well, looking at how we can use habitats and natural coastal processes, and also, like in the city, really heat is a big issue. And there's a lot of ways to work with tree canopy and vegetation to kind of reduce the urban heat island effect. So there's different elements of nature that are important to different climate perils. But, a lot of my work is focusing on how we work with nature to reduce those risks. Right.
So it becomes more important, obviously, the more developed a landscape is, for nature to sort of have a role. Is that kind of, I'm picking up this idea that like very rural landscapes might have a different kind of, we'll call it a risk profile, risk tolerance maybe, and nature plays a different role in sort of across those landscapes. Is that a fair way to kind of describe it?
Yeah, I mean, where we are is the risks are obviously very specific to the location where we are, even in the same watershed. The upstream is not the same as the downstream area, for example, or like, the heat is particularly problematic in larger cities because of the urban heat island effect. So as part of tackling these risks, we really need to kind of understand what the local risks are where we live in order to work with nature in the most appropriate way. And I guess the other thing I would say is, kind of thinking at the scale of nature. So we often manage things in kind of, artificial constructs of how we manage municipal or kind of community level things, but nature doesn't really take any notice of those. So the solution may be not in the place we want the effect. So we need to look upstream, we need to look downstream. So we don't really look at those scales enough, in my opinion, in Canada at the moment.
It kind of strikes me that in trying to solve one particular problem, like a heat issue, you kind of have to open up a whole bunch of different doors. And one of the things that is crossing my mind is this idea about governance, because, the solution might be somewhere where you have no jurisdiction, let's say, or no say. I kind of want to ask maybe a bit of a broader question. So what kind of challenges are you sort of running into with implementing sort of nature-based solutions or natural assets as a way of addressing some of these problems?
Yeah, I think we're not well set up at the watershed scale generally in terms of having bodies with legally mandated powers, I guess. And each province in Canada does things slightly differently. So we actually have a report on that coming out at the end of the month, which is a bit of a shameless plug. But so what we found in that report is that, a lot of money is being invested in climate adaptation through things like DMAF, but in very few places is that being applied at a watershed scale or by bodies that operate at a watershed scale. It's often being applied at a city, kind of more local scale, which limits the options that you can put into place if you don't have the jurisdiction, as you said. So there is one thing in the National Adaptation Strategy. There is a new program to encourage regional climate resilience on the coast, and it specifically says it's to help communities to work together. So that's a new program that we haven't really got much details about yet, but that's the kind of thing I think we need to be moving towards, is kind of working with nature. We need to work with natural systems at the right scale.
So I'm wondering also about sort of the understanding nature in the first place. So the inventory, so at the very beginning, the data, the inventory side of things, are there certain pieces of information that are really needed or really important if we're implementing nature-based work? Like, what does the inventory, what's the input look like from the data side?
So the approach that is taken by people like MNAI, there's obviously the inventory, as you said, but then there's like a conditioner assessment and evaluation in terms of services that are provided. And then the ultimate thing is the management plan, because what this approach in terms of managing natural assets is to kind of plan long-term maintenance, care, management, investment in nature, to kind of provide those services in the long term and make sure that we're not losing services in the face of risks like climate, because climate is not just going to have an impact on the built environment, it's also going to have an impact on our natural environment. So so there's a kind of a wheel of management, if you like, that kind of has these different steps in the management process. And it kind of also mirrors risk management. Like for risks, you need to kind of, identify the risk, evaluate the risk, and treat the risk. And then it goes into a feedback loop where you keep doing that. So these systems are all fairly intertwined. So
then can you maybe contrast a little bit? So, I mean, those very same pieces would be the same for watershed management plans that we have today. So the North Saskatchewan, as an example, we've done a state of the watershed, just like many other watersheds in the province. And we've done a management plan, which has things like riparian health, let's say. How different does that look when you start to look at management through a natural assets lens? How is there a big shift between the two?
No, and I think a lot of particularly watershed organizations probably have the inventory data already, because they're already doing that work, you know, because they are checking their baseline and they're monitoring their baseline. So it's very similar work. It's just, I think the difference maybe is the service emphasis, like the levels of service, looking at what is being provided to people, and you know, communities are starting to value that in monetary terms, so that they can recognize that in their financial statements or in their sustainability reporting, so that it actually has a value rather than being a kind of nice to have.
Right. So kind of flipping back to, I'm kind of jumping around a little bit in my thinking, but when we talked about challenges, you also had mentioned previously the biodiversity, the global biodiversity framework, and some of the climate adaptation work. So it sounds like there's a lot happening at sort of senior levels of government, like internationally and perhaps nationally. Are you seeing that trickling down? Like, is that, are you, first of all, are you seeing it coming from the top down, or is it implemented from the bottom up? Are you seeing sort of misses, like where they're not connecting? Are there things we could be doing better? Can I add a few more questions in there?
I think you're right. There's a lot of good forward momentum, particularly on the, you know, we've got the National Adaptation Strategy. We had the new Global Biodiversity Framework, so we will have another National Biodiversity Strategic Action Plan, I think is the NBSAP. So I think there's a lot of good work at the federal, well, we've had forward movement at the federal government level. The disconnect for me is, you know, the friction between federal and provincial jurisdiction, because, you know, a key thing is watershed management, and that is a provincial jurisdiction. So the situation in Canada at the moment is that approaches are quite fragmented and very different province to province, because we don't have a nationally agreed approach between provinces and the federal government. So that is hampering, to my kind of opinion, implementation of nature-based solutions, because we don't have this working at this nature scale in a consistent manner across the country.
Right. Do you see, well, let me take it in a different direction. So if you could design the ultimate governance, like if you could sort of, if you were queen for the day, you had your wand or whatever, you know, Harry Potter thing you'd like to do, what would it look like? Like, what would be the most effective, and I suspect I might know what you're going to say, but I'm going to ask the question anyway. So how would you design it if you could make it work from top to bottom?
Yeah, I mean, I would like to see a standardized watershed management planning procedure implemented across the country. If Europe can do that in each country, different countries, all, like there's a European law, the Water Framework Directive, that stipulates watershed management planning across all European countries. Obviously not the UK because we left, but that's another story. So if different countries in Europe to do that, I don't see why we shouldn't have a standardized approach that's obviously flexible enough to represent kind of regional differences. I appreciate that different watersheds face different pressures, and, you know, the different areas of Canada are very different. But if different countries in Europe can do that, I don't see why we can't do that in Canada, to agree a consistent watershed management planning approach.
Is there anything that you think watershed groups like, say, the North Saskatchewan should be doing sort of until we have this optimal governance kind of model, or any, you know, forward movement across the board? What can watershed groups do kind of to be supportive and advancing some of this work?
Yeah, you guys are key, I think, to bringing together communities to work together on like consistent objectives in the watershed, because different communities will have different viewpoints and won't necessarily exchange unless they have a forum to meet and discuss this. So a lot of watershed groups across Canada are actually key forums for discussion and setting common objectives. So there's a lot of watershed management going on. It's just they don't have the legal teeth or kind of permitting powers, apart from in Ontario, where they actually do play a role in land use planning. So they're really essential to have the discussions across different users. But I would like to see them have more powers in kind of, how we manage land use development in particular, so that we're not developing on the floodplain, for example.
Yeah, it's funny how, well, here in Alberta, there's been a lot of work recently on things like, well, in the recent years, it's been drought management, but flood management before that. And we sort of just go kind of bounce back and forth between them, depending on sort of how wet the year is. Let's maybe sort of take another sort of angle on natural assets and nature-based solutions, and where are we seeing really sort of innovative kind of concepts or ideas? Like what is the cutting edge in this field right now?
Yeah, so I feel really privileged to be working on the guidance for natural asset accounting for local governments actually in Canada. And I did attend COP15 because it was here in Montreal, so it was really local to me. So everyone came here. But I heard from the World Sustainable Business Council, for example, that Canadian local governments are seen as fairly world leading in how they're approaching natural asset management. Largely thanks to groups like MNAI and others who are kind of actively champing at the bit on this. So we have over 100 different local governments who are actively identifying, looking at condition of and valuing natural assets, and they are looking to acknowledge or disclose that information on their financial statements. So that is really cutting edge internationally. There is a British standard for natural capital accounting, but it's not commonly used by local governments. So in particular, that's something I feel very lucky to be involved with.
You're kind of highlighting another sort of angle on natural assets that I'm interested in, but I don't know very much about it, which is sort of the entire, all of the economics and valuations side of it. And I know that there's conversations around, well, should we be valuing things that way? And, all of some of those approaches, but can you describe sort of that side of the equation, the economics? Like, how does it play out, let's say, in a public, in a sort of a public realm? What does economics or valuation or markets, how do they play into this?
So in terms of valuing, it's actually the services from natural assets that we're valuing. And a lot of the work that we're doing is focusing on services that municipalities or local governments are responsible for. So things like water treatment or flood protection or heat protection, things like that. So when we haven't gone into really kind of the more cultural service provision. But those kind of sides of things do get taken up in Canada. We have the Census of Environment, which is a more holistic natural capital accounting approach at the national level. So that's being done by Statistics Canada, and is supposed to include more services, but at the moment they're kind of working on the biophysical account, so the extent of different assets. They've got data out on salt marshes and urban greenness already, but at the local level we're really focusing on what the municipalities or local governments are responsible for. And if they didn't have those natural assets, often how we value things is like the replacement service. So if you didn't have this wetland to store and filter the water, how much would you have to construct in terms of grey infrastructure to store that water and to treat it if you didn't have the wetland? So we often use replacement costs so that we have something very tangible. Or in terms of, flood protection, you'd be looking at hydraulic modeling and actually how much damage is avoided because you have that storage facility. So something that people can really grab onto. And it is important that we have a really solid auditable trail of that, because people do see this as a vague area, that and I think that's one of the reasons that we're so keen to try and standardize as well, so that we build a robust kind of business case.
It can't be that easy to do even just sort of that level evaluation, because as you mentioned earlier, sometimes the asset, the feature providing the benefit isn't near you. So I'm thinking of flood protection, let's say for the city of Edmonton, maybe coming from and is coming from the watershed upstream. So often it seems like in the reading I've done that a lot of the work is kind of quite local. And so that bringing it up to the watershed scale makes it just sort of emphasizes the fact that everybody needs to be working together, so you understand that your services are coming from assets that maybe aren't even in your jurisdiction.
Yeah, no, totally. And there is an example of a watershed scale natural asset valuation actually in Grindstone Creek in Ontario. So this is kind of an area where we are headed, looking, and there was actually some good cost benefit work looking at managing natural assets for flood protection by Renus in Quebec.
Yeah.
So yeah, we are seeing a trend towards being more inclusive of the watershed scale. So
are we moving to a place where, or maybe we're there now, where municipalities might see investment in natural infrastructure, natural assets? Like, is there? It seems like we're talking about inventory and then condition and evaluation, and valuation, but then is there actually money flowing for these things, or is it a balance sheet kind of exercise?
Yeah, I think so. How we've tried to frame the argument as well, it's kind of departments in local governments also kind of vying for investment. So people like parks, whereas the swimming pool has the receipts of who's using, the cash flow, the people managing urban parks don't have the same data to work with. So actually providing that is actually helping people distribute, or municipalities distribute money internally to invest in what they need to invest in long term. So there's that kind of side of it. We are seeing flows of cash from the federal government does have the Natural Infrastructure Fund. And I think that is an area where natural infrastructure will be increasingly included in what Infrastructure Canada funds under kind of their funding streams, which are multiple. And I would like to see kind of mainstreaming of natural infrastructure in all infrastructure projects, like rather than just this is a natural infrastructure project. It's like, well, how does natural infrastructure figure in every project? So there's that element. And I think from the I'm kind of post COP15, I'm trying to follow the biodiversity credits conversation quite closely, which is kind of an emerging area as people are trying to work out what their internal nature related risks are, what their impacts are, and looking at their disclosures relating to nature, which is the sister of the climate related disclosures. I won't go into it because it's probably a fairly dry area, but so people are like companies, I think, will become more aware of their impacts on nature, and the biodiversity credit market is very emerging at the moment. So that's a space to watch.
So can you just double click on that concept, this credit thing, and kind of go one level deeper, just to explain kind of what we're talking about, like go back to the basics on it, because I mean, I think I have an idea what biodiversity credits are and how they work, but I better test my assumption that I know what we're talking about.
Yeah, it's an emerging sector at the moment, and it's not an area I've delved into personally in research. But I'm following what the WEF are doing on it quite closely. But it's not like an offset, because obviously there's a time lag between, if you can't just destroy biodiversity in one place and then immediately replace it somewhere else. So there was quite a lot of discussion about the fact it's not really an offset at COP. I heard quite a lot of talk about that.
Yeah.
But it is, I think they're terming it kind of certificates or credits to kind of encourage private companies to invest in nature. So that has a value. So it's another way of, I guess, all these mechanisms, we're trying to shoehorn the value of nature into a world that values money. So it's another way of trying to do that.
Does it play out in sort of the insurance industry or the banking industry? Like, do we see it popping into those spaces as well?
Yeah, in the insurance industry, there's a couple of examples now of parametric insurance where, natural assets such as dune systems or coral reefs are being insured because they protect communities. And if they get damaged, basically the insurance company pays out so that they are restored. So that's, and I know insurance companies and the Insurance Bureau of Canada are particularly interested in how they can work to kind of increase investment and restoration of natural infrastructure. So that's an area of interest, definitely. In terms of the banking sector, that's what I heard on the sidelines of the by business and finance days at COP was there's a lot of piloting of the task force for nature-related climate disclosure, nature-related financial disclosures system, which is in beta at the moment. So it's being tested.
Yeah.
So people are more kind of focused on what their internal risks are, because it's essentially a risk management tool, but there are references to opportunities in there. So obviously investing in nature to improve resilience is a key opportunity, and how that figures into it. But TNFD is not the same as, you're not valuing kind of stocks and flows. You're kind of valuing risk and opportunity, which is not quite the same thing. So there's a lot of focus on that in the investment banking world.
So are there examples, and I often go to the sort of not so much the private industry side, but the sort of public, like where municipalities might focus. Are we seeing examples of funding flowing for those types of things?
I think we're at the start of it.
Okay.
I know that my colleagues in the UK, I've asked them about this, like how they're working on securing private investment in nature. And a lot of the investment has been place-based. So they've secured private investment in a specific localized scheme to restore like a wetland or particular function. And there's been some kind of profile for the investor from investing in that. So that place-based investment, I think, is somewhere where we could do more. We're also looking, I think the public investment is likely to increase, as well as there's private investment, but public investment, I know that we're looking at the Investing in Canada infrastructure program is being renewed. So I would think that natural infrastructure will come higher up the pecking order in a renewal of that program.
Right. And I asked that question mostly because, like, for us as a watershed group, a lot of our key members are municipalities working sort of on the ground, and knowing how all of this will translate potentially to affecting their bottom line. There's always that pressure to do more with less, or just keep doing more, like just keep adding. And so it's good to hear that there might be some other opportunities for municipalities.
Well, I think as well, so there's the DMF money, so the National Adaptation Strategies, had chunks of cash for DMF, so the Disaster Mitigation Adaptation Fund, which is for larger, and there's a smaller scale project stream as well. But money was also given to FCM, and I did speak with FCM, and they are looking at natural infrastructure as being eligible for funding through that. I think the program will not be up and running for another few months yet, but you know, those two funding streams through the National Adaptation Strategy would include natural infrastructure.
Right. So municipalities can start to look at some of those pieces now, and also just, well, I'm thinking in terms of just like us as a watershed group, municipalities are on a track and they're trying to sort of see where they should be, where they should be going. So if you had advice for municipalities, let's say, similar to watershed groups, what would be some of your key points you would want municipalities to consider?
I think the point we covered about looking at how they can work with others in their watershed, and you know, I think piecing together projects that cover different jurisdictions. Like I'm thinking of the city of Surrey, for example, had a fairly strategic project that was funded with the city of Delta and First Nations. Yeah. But it takes a while to bring everybody to the same page to get a kind of strategic level project, but it can be really worth it in the long term. And I think those are the projects that would, are going to be funded hopefully through DMAF, different rounds of DMAF. So
yeah. So I know, excuse me, we're coming down sort of to the last little bit, because I do want to allow some time for people who are listening to put their questions into the chat and ask you their questions. But I've got sort of two to three little things to ask. One is there anything that we're not sort of talking about that you think is be important to cover when we talk about natural assets and community resilience? Is there anything we've missed?
I think there is concern about putting a price on nature, and that that's just, we had a conversation with the Public Sector Accounting Board on natural assets, and that was a key point that was kind of brought up. Nature is not just monetary value, and I think we're not trying to say this is just the limit of what it's worth. It's not putting a price, but it's actually trying to value or make transparent the value of the services that is being provided, because at the moment decisions are being made assuming that nature is worth nothing, and that's what's got us into the situation we're in, basically. So it's not trying to say this is what your field is worth, now someone can buy it. Yeah. It's trying to make the value transparent so that we make better and more sound economic decisions.
So really putting it on a playing field, or leveling the playing field so that you can actually start to talk about it as part of the picture.
Yeah, and I think it's particularly a Western viewpoint problem, right? Because money is king in our values system, whereas Indigenous peoples have been managing nature, and nature is number one in their value system, so they don't have this problem of trying to make that value transparent because it's already top of the list. Whereas for us, it's money, possibly then people, and nature at the bottom.
Yeah, it's a conversation that I know we've had just even internally with staff around how do you try and balance these different things, and is it right to do it in certain ways? So I'm live to that conversation. I kind of want to ask, so what brings you into this space? So what is it that lights you up about working in this space? So it's kind of, why do you do what you do?
So I'm a Libra, so I'm all about balance, and it bothers me that we are out of balance with nature. And that's where I come at this really with a kind of trying to restore some balance to our relationship with nature. And I'm an outdoors person. I love being in nature, so it's trying to improve things for society, but also it's a bit selfish as well, and improve things for us as people. And that includes basically reestablishing a more balanced relationship with nature.
Yeah, it kind of kicks back to that idea that we just immediately prior, we were talking about actually having nature factor in the conversation, right? We purposely or maybe unknowingly exclude it and devalue it even in our own minds. So I appreciate the work that you do to bring it to light so it actually becomes part of the conversation. So my last question is, Is there and this is a heads up for you, Mary Ellen, that we're going to be coming over to you for questions from anybody in the audience. And so please feel free to post them in the chat if you have anything you'd like to ask Joanna. But is there a resource that you think everybody should know about when it comes to natural assets?
I would check out the Municipal Natural Assets Initiative web pages for kind of work case studies of municipalities that have already gone through natural asset management processes. And we work with MNAI and KPMG on a report that we published in October. That basically brings together a lot of the kind of international and national drivers and kind of state of play in this area. So I'd recommend that for a good overview. And then the Global Biodiversity Framework, because that's not covered in my report because it was in October. So and then the Global Biodiversity Framework has 23 actions that, you know, I'm kind of making sure I'm familiar with, because we can use those to drive action in Canada, seeing as, you know, we were one of the world leaders that were kind of pushing this in Montreal in December. So yeah, I think those actions, I'm trying to bring those into today conversations as well.
Well, thank you. And we'll make sure that we put the links for those various pieces into our what we would call show notes and be part of the recording. So Mary Ellen, I know so Mary Ellen is actually our NSWA lead in the natural assets space, and she may have some of her own questions. But Mary Ellen, are there any questions that you would like to raise?
Yeah, we've had quite a few come in. The first was from Kara, and she was wondering about the frameworks that you mentioned. So I think it was just a question of clarity on the ones that you referenced, but you mentioned them at the end here, which is the Global Biodiversity Framework. So I think that answers that question. But then we have another one, unless you want to add another.
Well, I would just say that there's now a useful web page. So they've got their act together at the CBD now. So there's a web page, and I've just posted the link in the chat that actually sets out the 23 objectives in a very easily readable format so that people can get familiar with them. And I would draw your attention to target 11, which is about restoring and enhancing nature's contribution to people.
Perfect, thank you. And then the next question is from Cameron, and they're wondering, are there First Nations involved with the dialogue about natural asset management, and especially are they providing any oversight and input into the use of Western economic terminology within and adding that to this, what they refer to as a reductionist monetary system?
So we have been engaging in the working group on the voluntary guidance with the First Nations Financial Management Board. And I know MNAI have got specific projects where they're working with Indigenous nations on natural asset management work. So we are trying to make sure that we are including different viewpoints as well. And I think that's super important. And in many projects that I've worked on involving natural assets or nature-based solutions, I'm kind of highly aware that reconnection with nature is kind of, you know, an important part of reconciliation as well, because in our grey infrastructure dominated landscapes, Indigenous peoples may not see themselves at the moment, from what I've heard from different people that have been talking about it. And so if we can reconnect with nature, that it can be an important step in the right direction for everybody.
Okay, thank you. And then earlier you also mentioned the case study in Surrey, the city of Surrey, where there was the First Nations working in partnership to develop that natural asset management plan, it sounded like. Is that a case?
It's actually a DMF project looking at there's living dikes, which are kind of pseudo natural assets, but there's some kind of interesting more working with nature approaches. There's some traditional approaches in that project too, but it's a bit of a mix, and it's a good example of communities working together to get a more strategic approach.
Right, and is that available online for us to dig a little deeper into?
I think the details of the project are online. I'm not sure what reporting is publicly available, but I can forward what I have or the contact details of people who are looking after that.
Great, thank you. We also have a question here from Vanessa, who is curious about how the public can individually get involved with or supporting this work.
Yeah, so we're actually putting together we have these 3 steps documents looking at kind of how people can look at tackling climate risk at home, and we're actually developing a natural infrastructure one of how people can work with nature around their own home to reduce climate risks. That might be of interest. It's not out yet, but I'm working on it. And I think you know, generally people there may be kind of, particularly in urban areas, there's a lot of municipalities working on greening and urban tree canopy, increasing kind of vegetation cover in cities. Like we have green alleyways here in Montreal that people can get involved with. So, you know, there's your own home, but there's also community projects to get involved with as well. And maybe I think about voting also in these situations. Like it's important, if you believe in these approaches, to vote for people who are going to carry them out.
A very good point.
You know, I'll jump in on that one just to say there's a lot of stewardship groups, what we would call stewardship groups here in Alberta, that work at the local level. So individual lakes or watershed groups as well that are kind of front and center here too. So it's there's all kinds of places you might plug in, whether it's your municipality or your sort of environmental stewardship type of approaches.
Great point. We also have another question here from Cameron, who's wondering if you can dig a bit deeper into explaining how the Intact Center might be monitoring biodiversity at the watershed scale. I know COP15 just kind of came out, so maybe this is early in the discussion, but if you have any insights as to where it's headed.
Yeah, we're not involved with monitoring biodiversity per se. We're kind of we're more involved in kind of trying to set standards or guidance for people of how to do that work. So monitoring was one of the standards that we're thinking of in terms of natural asset. Like there's a series of standards that are going to be probably required. So we have the inventory one that will be published in the next few months, I think, that, you know, it's a CSA standard. So it's a product of thinking from organizations across the country. That's not an Intact Center publication, but yeah, so we're trying to contribute on that front. And then we're also trying to contribute on the technical kind of nature-based solution front for river coastal management in terms of design guidance, working with the National Research Council, or working on, for example, a coastal nature-based solution guide, and kind of just trying to promote working with nature approaches wherever we can when we're talking about infrastructure. So that's most of the work we're doing. We're not monitoring biodiversity per se. We're more trying to, because our focus is mostly on climate adaptation.
I'm going to sneak in my question. It might be a little bit of a tough question, but are there any services that cannot or maybe should not be monetized that we could maybe incorporate into a valuation system in another way other than monetizing it? Have you seen that come up?
Yeah, and I think that's totally. I think, you know, there's different ways of valuing things, and you know, maybe you know, the monetary road is really to speak to a certain portion of society, like the accountants and the financial sector, but other people are very uncomfortable putting dollar values on services. And you know, we specifically try to term that we're valuing services and not natural assets themselves, because we recognize those things that are very difficult and very personal in terms of their value. And it's a key area of research as well, in terms of kind of those more, particularly cultural services, I think, that are, you know, really reflective of the personal viewpoints of the communities and just the intrinsic value of nature, that's quite difficult to value too. So we're trying to stick to the easy things that are kind of more the, municipal responsibility services and kind of, steering clear of actually saying that this is the price of nature.
Yeah, very good point. Do we have time for a couple more there, Scott, or?
I think we have time for, say, one more, and then we should honor people's time for sure. Thanks.
Okay. Actually, this question might be for you, Scott. Elizabeth is wondering, do you have any recommendations for municipalities that are doing watershed planning, or they're doing their municipal planning that's located in many watersheds? And this comes up in our watershed as well. So do you want to take a stab at that one? What advice you would have for Elizabeth?
So I would say, this is the challenge of services or environment that goes beyond your borders. So you have to work with your fellow municipalities so that you can have a common vision, common future that you're trying to aim for. And then to the degree possible, you're trying to actually work together a little bit to gather the information you need, as Joanna and I sort of talked about in the natural asset space, services that maybe you may be benefiting from services that are provided by someone else in your watershed or somewhere else in your watershed. So with that in mind, it is in sort of the best interests of all the people in the watershed to work together with a bit of a common vision. But I do want to give the last word over to Joanna on this item to say, what would you add or change in that response, or my response?
Yeah, I think the collaboration is key. Obviously, you covered that. So I think it's the kind of powers or the kind of legitimacy of watershed plans that I would like to see enhanced as well. But that's down to probably provincial governments of how they do that. And I think, there's a lot of lobbying of the federal government on adaptation, but the jurisdictional kind of divide between, there's a limit to what the federal government can do in terms of kind of making the governance better. So I think it really is down to the provincial government and also, a lot of organizations have responsibility for certain aspects of watershed management. Like, for example, in Quebec, where I am, the watershed organizations are responsible for things like nature conservation and looking at water quality and stuff, but they are not responsible for flood management. So that kind of connect between, putting together a solution that actually does more than one thing. It might soak up carbon, it might store flood water, and even the funding that comes down, we're often looking at one service only. We're looking at carbon, we're looking at, flood reduction, or we're looking at biodiversity. So we need to stack up those benefits more, and I think that's kind of a key role of watershed organizations as well, to make sure we're kind of making the robust business case, looking at all the benefits.
Excellent. So I guess just before we we pass it back to Mary Ellen to sort of wrap us up, I just wanted to say thank you for taking the time for the conversation today, Joanna. I know it's not going to be the last conversation we have, but I appreciate you sort of taking the time to share some of your thoughts with the folks that have joined us today. So thanks very much.
No, thank you. And I could talk for way more than an hour. So if anyone wants to contact me after the fact, then, I think you guys have my email address, and I'd be more than happy to hear from people.
Excellent. Thank you. Back to you, Mary Ellen.
All right. I'm going to share my screen here again. So we do have a winner for the let me see, for the riparian web portal sweater, as well as the calendar, and I see that Jill put it in the Caitlin Phillip Thanks, Jill. Very much appreciate it. So Caitlin, we will be sending you the sweater, and and I'm sure we have your contact information, but please maybe private message Jill just to confirm that we have your information and the size of sweater that you would like. So is it going to go forward? There we go. If you need to get a hold of us, you can reach us by email. We're at water@nswa.ab.ca. And you can visit us on social media and via our newsletter. Our newsletter is a really great way to hear about all the great projects that we're doing. We will be sending out the link for today's recording of the session once it's up on YouTube. And finally, just want to say thank you again to our speakers, Scott and Joanna, as well as everyone here today for participating in today's session. Our next session will be taking place on April 5th, and we hope to see you there as well. So everybody enjoy the rest of your day and take care.